Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program. We're looking forward to an interactive session, and we'll get started. So I'm Jim Kenney. I'm Manager of Specialty and Pharmacy Contracts at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. So I'm going to moderate the session this evening. So our learning objectives for this evening, we're going to discuss best practices in treating rare and orphan diseases. We're going to evaluate challenges of ensuring the optimal patient care, balancing the use of improvement metrics such as FEV1 and importance of non-quantifiable factors such as health-related quality of life, assess the disease burden of CF beyond lung damage and pulmonary exacerbations, and identify the function of CFTR modifiers and how current and in-development agents work by correcting the core genetic defects in patients with CF, reducing disease burden, and improving patient-reported outcomes. Here are our faculty disclosures. Give you a minute to look at those. So this activity is supported by an educational grant from Vertex Pharmaceuticals to Postgraduate Institute for Medicine. We want to thank them for their support. And all the activity content and materials have been developed solely by the activity directors, planning committee members, and my fellow faculty presenters, and are free of any influence from Vertex Pharmaceuticals. So, challenges of treating rare and orphan diseases is my section. All right, so let's start with some basic information on the rare diseases. So from the National Institutes of Health, rare diseases in the U.S. total around 6,000 to 7,000. Obviously, we don't have drugs to treat all these diseases, but from a health plan perspective or an insurance perspective, each time we get a new drug to treat a rare disease, it's a major event because they are rare diseases and the drugs tend to be quite expensive. 25 million Americans are affected by rare disease. The time to diagnosis on average is 5 to 7 years, based on industry estimates. In some cases, it takes over 30 years before a diagnosis may be made for an ultra-rare disease. And you can imagine the medical resource expense and utilization in some of those patients over the years until they actually get to the point where they get the correct diagnosis. Some definitions. In the US, the definition of orphan disease is 200,000 people or less with the disease. And that's from the FDA's definition, if you will. In Europe, it's less than 5 per 10,000. Australian definition, less than 2,000 people. Japan, it's 2.5 cases per 10,000. And for the World Health Organization, it's 6.5 to 10 per 10,000. So if you think about it, it doesn't really matter from our perspective how you define it. We still have the challenge of having to manage patients with these rare diseases. And then the term ultra-orphan has sprung up in the literature, meaning about 1 in 50,000 people in the US. And in the UK, it's fewer than 1,000 people with a rare disease. Again, ultra-orphan, orphan, from our perspective, really similar approach to taking an active role in managing these patients. Some examples of rare diseases: Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, hereditary angioedema, Tourette syndrome, muscular dystrophy, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. You know, it's a fascinating area because when these drugs first come to market for a rare disease and we don't have any others prior to, we've typically never even heard of the disease. So you look at a disease like hereditary angioedema, 5 years ago, we didn't know what it was. Now we have five drugs to treat it. We're almost experts on a rare disease because we have so much interest and so many drugs to treat it. So you have to come up very quickly up to speed in terms of understanding the diseases as best you can and try to figure out how we integrate these therapies and are there differences between them that we can try from a management perspective. So in terms of the condition, again, it affects 200,000 or fewer individuals. But development and sales of the product. So these are FDA rare disease definitions, rare disease definitions. So 200,000 or fewer individuals. It affects more than 200,000 individuals. However, the development and sales of the product will not be sufficient to recoup the cost. So it can be a larger population by FDA definition and still be designated as an orphan drug. And medical devices and medical foods would also classify under the Orphan Drug Act if they would not be developed without some level of assistance. So the next slide is really more of a trivia point that you can use if you play pharmacy trivia or you're at a cocktail party and you want to throw something out. The actual definitions for medical foods come under the Orphan Drug Act. So medical food is a food which is formulated to be consumed or administered enterally under supervision of a physician. And basically, it has to be based on scientific principles, medical evaluation, so very strict definition. What's interesting about medical foods is, for the most part, plans exclude these from coverage. So even though they're covered under the Orphan Drug Act by definition, they're a complete separate category of product, if you will, that is treated very differently. In terms of the regulations, the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1992. Then around 2011, there were some proposed changes to the Act, which weren't actually posted until June of 2013 and actually codified in August of 2013. And what these really did is create some additional definitions for the pathway to get a drug approved. It also allowed for a drug to be an orphan drug to be approved, even if it was the same drug that was already approved as an orphan drug, if a manufacturer could demonstrate superiority to the first drug that was approved. So it really put some additional definitions, if you will, within the Act to assist in bringing more of these products to the market. The FDA Office of Orphan Products Development's mission is to advance the evaluation and development of products, including drugs, biologics, devices, and medical foods, that demonstrate promise for the diagnosis and/or treatment of rare diseases. So certainly a well-established premise, if you will, for bringing these drugs to market. But again, this goes all the way back to '92, so a long time on the books, if you will. So they do grant special status to the product that gets approved. It does receive an orphan status or orphan designation. There are development incentives, so they're not subject to the Prescription Drug User Fee Act fees. Tax credits for qualified testing are also allowed, and the patent length is for 7 years. So again, very specific in terms of the regulations surrounding approval and requirements, but also some advantages. And the reason for that is the sense from the FDA was manufacturers would not be likely to try to bring drugs to market for rare diseases if they couldn't find it to be at least somewhat profitable. So these incentives were designed to make it more attractive to companies to bring these products to market. And if you went to the session this morning on specialty drugs, there are about 50% of the drugs that are in specialty for orphan diseases that are coming to market over the next 5 to 10 years. So there's a significant interest in orphan drugs and bringing these products to market. The standard process applies in order to achieve marketing approval. Clinical trials are definitely required, and the safety and effectiveness must be demonstrated by adequate and well-controlled studies. So not really different from small molecules or the traditional NDA process or new drug application process that we see for the small molecule space or the non-orphan drugs. Testing, clinical trials required. In terms of the approval pathway, a product can be approved as a new molecular entity, obviously, but you can have a new use of an existing product that gets approved, or as I mentioned earlier in one of the changes to the Act in 2013, you can have an existing drug with data that demonstrates superiority to the original approved orphan drug. And we saw that in multiple sclerosis with Avonex being the first interferon beta 1A product to come to the market, and then a few years later, Serono brought Rebif, the same drug actually, right? Interferon beta 1A, they brought it to market. But in the first 24-week trial data, they demonstrated superiority to Avonex. So even though Avonex was approved as an orphan drug, Serono was still able to bring Rebif to market as a second orphan drug for the same indication, the same drug, because it complied with that new language that had been put into the Orphan Drug Act in 2013. Here are some examples of approved orphan drugs. So we see here at the top ivacaftor or Kalydeco from Vertex for cystic fibrosis. And we have Lumacaftor, ivacaftor, or Orkambi. Then we have tetrabenazine or zenazine from Lundbeck for Huntington's disease. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we've got 5 products here for hereditary angioedema. 3 with a similar mechanism, C1 esterase inhibitors, and then 2 others, icatibant and calanetide, both with different mechanisms, but all 5 of these drugs are approved as orphan drugs for hereditary angioedema, a rare disease. Basic principles regarding orphan drugs: small numbers of patients, certainly very challenging to diagnose patients with these diseases. Few specialists available to treat these diseases. Lack of treatment may mean mortality at a very young age, so very frustrating to treat some of these patients. Typically, there are no competitive alternatives. So from a plan perspective, if we're going to apply some utilization management, very often we don't have an alternative we can step or place in front of one of these agents. So it does increase pressure to make these products available and cover them a bit more widely. Symptom control versus disease modification is also very often what we see with some of these drugs that come to market. So they're not necessarily halting disease progression or reversing disease. They're really treating the symptoms of the disease, and in some cases, maybe delaying progression to some extent. In terms of benefit coverage for these products, certainly they can be covered under the pharmacy. Most health plans, if a drug is self-administered, that will fall under the pharmacy benefit. So you have formulary designs that may apply here, whether it's an open formulary, which means most drugs are covered by default, or a closed formulary. You can certainly not cover an orphan drug on a closed formulary, at least initially, and most plans will have a 6-month moratorium on these new drugs, but there's going to be certain pressure once that drug gets approved, whether it's from patients, providers in the network, or advocacy groups, to have those things covered. But one of the nice things about a closed formulary design is it gives the plan an opportunity to at least figure out how they want to manage the drug, how they want it placed in therapy so that it gets to the right patients and we eliminate waste and so forth. In terms of tiering, most of these drugs based on cost would fall in some type of specialty tier or high cost tier, which could mean a high out-of-pocket for the patient in terms of co-payments or co-insurance. Many of the manufacturers do have assistance programming, whether it's co-pay assistance or in the case of patients that may be Medicare or programs that aren't eligible for the traditional coupon programs or copay assistance. There are foundations that manufacturers can donate to that can help out patients who can't afford some of these products. Certainly if patients have deductibles or coinsurance, then that out-of-pocket can be quite significant and to some extent prohibitive. So these assistance programs can be quite helpful for those patients. If we look at the medical benefit side for these products, so if they're physician administered or require administration by a health professional, more often than not, they will be covered under the medical benefit, which means formulary tiers may be in place. Some plans have different tiering structures on the medical benefit. More often than not, that's not the case. It's typically reviewed through some type of technology assessment committee rather than a more traditional pharmacy and therapeutics committee. We have J codes that bill the drugs as opposed to the NDC codes or the claim system that we see on the pharmacy side. And new drugs that launch don't typically have codes, so the billing and the processing of claims is very challenging. So if you have one of these drugs that is covered on the medical benefit and the physician or the facility has to buy the product and bill it, so the traditional buy and bill methodology, there's no way they can do a test claim. There's no way they can be certain that they're going to get reimbursed for that claim. So in some cases, the claims system, if you will, due to lack of granularity of the coding, may be a challenge for the drug to be actually purchased and provided until the facility or the provider can be assured that they're going to get reimbursed. And if the drug is $50,000 for one treatment, that's a significant burden on the facility or the practice to say, I want to make sure I'm going to get paid for this and reimbursed before I do that. So the administration location can also be significant, whether it's a hospital outpatient or inpatient, physician office, an infusion clinic, or perhaps home infusion if the drug is an infused therapy. And certainly the cost of the delivery of the product decreases as we go from the hospital setting to the home infusion setting. A number of plans try to manage some of these drugs in that way, where they may drive the site of service to home infusion, to a less costly site of service. The drug cost doesn't change dramatically, but there may be facility fees or other costs associated with a hospital setting that are avoided if the patient can have the drug administered in the home, and certainly if you can self-administer, that's going to be a benefit as well. Other plans may choose to allow a medical drug, if you will, by benefit, to flow through the pharmacy system, if you will. So they'll process the drug like a pharmacy claim, but at the end of the month, they'll take those dollars and put them back in the medical benefit. So the dollars remain in the correct benefits where they belong, but by facilitating the claims adjudication through the pharmacy, you take the burden off the practice to have to buy and bill the product, but you also have the capability of tracking and monitoring the product more accurately. Because the pharmacy claim system from day one have NDC level capability, and you can track and monitor that product, and you can apply your utilization management more directly through pharmacy and electronically in an easier fashion than you can on the medical benefit side. So if we look at distribution, that also is a driver here. If it's the pharmacy channel, certainly products can be channeled through retail, mail, or specialty. Again, with orphan drugs, most often they're going to be a specialty pharmacy distribution, and the manufacturer may choose to make the drug what would be classified as limited distribution, which simply means that the manufacturer chooses one or maybe a handful of specialty pharmacies and designates those pharmacies as the only pharmacies that will dispense the product. And certainly we see that with Orkambi. From Vertex, there are 4 specialty pharmacies that are designated to dispense that product. So the health plan has to negotiate with the specialty pharmacy first and foremost, and then the specialty pharmacy has to be in the pharmacy network of the plan in order for the claims to be processed. So there can be an administrative burden there as well. Even though it's pharmacy, as I mentioned, they're pretty much ready to go from time zero. You still have to make sure that the pharmacy is coded and loaded into the system in order for that to occur. And then, as I already mentioned, on the buy and bill side, the physician or the facility has to purchase, and that may be a direct purchase from the manufacturer. They may have to also source the product through a specialty pharmacy, or possibly the specialty pharmacy will have a wholesaler division. So if you look at a company like Express Scripts, CuraScript Specialty Pharmacy is part of the Express Scripts system that can actually act as a wholesaler and ship product to providers if needed. And again, a lot of that is controlled by the manufacturer in terms of how they choose to make the product available for distribution. In terms of utilization management, I mean, all the usual utilization management tools are employed, certainly with orphan drugs. Prior authorization, pre-certification, restricting prescribing to specialists, diagnostic confirmation of disease. Some plans require simple attestation by the physician. Does the patient have the 508del mutation? If yes, check the box. Other plans may require formal documentation, a report, a medical report, a genetics report. We can limit access to the labeled indication only. And what we're really trying to do here is to make sure that the patient gets to the drug gets to the right patient. We want to make sure that we're not wasting drug, we're not trying it on patients that really aren't indicated to get the product. And at a drug cost of $250,000 for some of these drugs annually, that's a significant cost to the health plan that we're trying to avoid if, in fact, the patient is not a valid candidate for the drug. We can certainly employ step edits if appropriate, not typically the case with orphan drugs, but there may be a drug that's given in combination with a drug. Maybe you need to provide a vitamin along with a product or some other ancillary drug. We're going to want to make sure that that's in place as well. Quantity limits pretty standard, 30-day maximums in the specialty space, and some plans employ what's called a split fill program. And really all that is giving the patient less than a 30-day quantity for that first fill or the first couple of fills, just to make sure they can tolerate the medication. If they tolerate it, they're able to get the remainder of the fill at no additional out-of-pocket, and then subsequent refills can be for 30-day supplies. And reauthorization is very common as well, at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, depending on the drug, depending on the tolerability of that product. Because again, we want to make sure if a patient goes on that medication at that 3 or 6 month point, we want to have at least a conversation or an interaction with the provider to say, as long as it's working, we want to continue providing the drug and paying for it. But if it's not, we at least want to ask that question. In terms of monitoring the pipeline from our perspective, as I mentioned, there's lots of orphan drugs coming. Industry meetings like AMCP, we had an excellent presentation first thing this morning that looked at the specialty pipeline. We use our pharmacy benefit manager as a resource. The specialty pharmacies are also a resource. Other health plans, certainly FDA.gov website can be very helpful, clinicaltrials.gov, and manufacturer pipeline presentations. So we're constantly monitoring the pipeline to see how are these products progressing through the trials, and are they going to make it to the market. In terms of the financials, very high cost, very low volume. Traditional rebates or rebates of any kind are certainly uncommon. We do have some rebates on these drugs, but not very common, so they're not typically a significant offset. Risk or outcomes-based contracting certainly is an opportunity here. If we have these drugs and there's a chance that they may not work, perhaps we can negotiate some type of outcomes arrangement with the manufacturer to do 2 things. One is assess the efficacy of the drug and really study it more closely and share that information with the manufacturer, but also get some price relief if we do have a certain population that don't respond to the drug. It does put utilization management pressure on the small molecules or other diseases, right? If we can't restrict these drugs significantly, now the pressure's turned, unfortunately, on their colleagues that work in other sections of the business that treat chronic disease, because we can apply that there. And we're under a lot of pressure to try to control spend. And this is a significant issue if you have a self-insured employer. So if they have one of these patients and they're self-insured, they're going to be on the hook for the cost, as opposed to someone who's in a premium-based system where the health plan would be on the hook or at risk for the cost. And again, copay assistance or foundation support is important. So there are coverage pressures, certainly due to the unmet clinical need. Those pressures can come from the private sector, from the public sector. The news media, key opinion leaders, and certainly advocacy groups are can be a key pressure. And if we look at some of these advocacy groups, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, the U.S. Hereditary Angioedema Association, there's the Huntington Disease Society of America, Cystic Fibrosis Foundations. Certainly every one of these rare diseases, for the most part, has some advocacy group that is going to be a champion for these patients when these drugs get approved, and to try to minimize resistance to these as they come to market. So key takeaways: orphan drugs are defined by federal regulation and affect a small number of patients. They're typically unique with limited competition, and plans use benefit designs to define and promote appropriate use under both the medical and pharmacy benefits. Thank you.